There is something that happens to a person when they have carried a thing too long. Not a breaking, no, nothing so clean as that. It is more like a slow hollowing, the way a riverbank erodes not in one flood, but across 10,000 quiet mornings, until one day you press your hand to the earth and find there is nothing solid left beneath. That is what this silence has done to me. And I am 91 years old, or near enough to it that the difference no longer matters. And I have decided that the hollow needs to be filled, not with excuses, not with explanations, but with the truth, spoken plainly, to whoever will hear it. I should tell you something about my memory before I begin. It is not what it was. Names slip from me the way wet cloth slips from a line in wind. Faces blur at the edges. But the night I am going to describe to you, that night has never blurred. Not once in all the years between then and now. Some memories are preserved by guilt the way fruit is preserved in brine, and they stay sharp and cold and unchanged no matter how much time passes over them. This is one of those. My name is Clara Marsh, née Whitfield, and I was born in the autumn of 1837 in a county in western Virginia that smelled of wood smoke and turned clay, and the particular sharpness of Cold Creek water. My father farmed. His father farmed before him. We were not poor by the measure of that place in that time, but comfort was a thing you earned before sunrise and defended until well after dark, and no one in our part of the world thought much about leisure or ease. You worked because the alternative was ruin, and ruin came quickly and without apology in those years. I was married at 19 to a man named George Marsh, a good man in most of the ways that counted, quiet and steady and not given to cruelty. We settled on a piece of land 2 miles east of the town of Harwick, which was less a town than a gathering of intentions. A dry goods store, a church with a roof that leaked in 3 places, a mill, a post office that operated out of the back of someone's kitchen. There were perhaps 40 families within reasonable distance of one another, and as is the way with such communities, everyone knew the shape of everyone else's life, even when they did not know the details. Our nearest neighbor, at a distance of perhaps a quarter mile down the road and across a shallow creek, was a man named Edmund Aldridge. He had come to Harwick roughly 5 years before George and I arrived, which is to say around 1856 or 57. I cannot be entirely certain of the year, and I will not pretend otherwise. He had purchased the old Hessler property, which had sat empty for 2 seasons, and he had worked it alone. No wife, no children, no relations that anyone ever saw visit. He kept a small number of cattle, some chickens, a kitchen garden, and he traded in town with the same quiet regularity as any other man, paid his debts, attended church on most Sundays, and gave no one obvious cause for concern. And yet, there is a feeling that certain people produce in you, not fear exactly and not dislike, something more like the feeling of a room where a window has been closed too long. The air is not wrong. Nothing is visibly wrong, but something in you recognizes the staleness before your mind has found the word for it. Edmund Aldridge produced that feeling in me from nearly the first time I met him. I told myself it was nothing. Women in those days were encouraged to dismiss their instincts as nerves or fancy, and I had absorbed that lesson as thoroughly as anyone. George liked him well enough. They were not close friends, George was not a man who made close friends easily, but they could stand together at the fence line and talk about weather and prices and the state of the road without discomfort. And in that community, that was friendship enough. I watched Edmund from a distance, the way you watch something you cannot quite place. He was perhaps 40 when I first knew him, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had begun to go gray at the temples, and a way of moving that was deliberate and unhurried in a manner that could seem either calm or careful, depending on the light. He did not look at people directly when he spoke to them, not rudely. He was never rude, but as though his gaze needed to be kept available for other things. I never told George about the feeling. What would I have said? That I found our neighbor unsettling without any evidence to offer? George was a practical man. He would have been kind about it, but he would not have known what to do with such a thing, and I would have felt foolish for saying it. So I kept the feeling to myself. I kept many things to myself in those years. That was simply the practice of my life. Not out of shame, but out of habit. The way you keep a lamp trimmed and your doubts to yourself and your hands occupied. Because that is what survival looked like for a woman in 1861. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that by the following autumn, Edmund Aldridge would be gone. Not dead, as far as anyone could prove. Not moved, as far as anyone could find. Simply gone, the way something disappears when you look away at precisely the wrong moment, and when you look back, the space where it was feels too quiet, too still, too deliberately empty. And I was the only one who had seen what happened. I had said nothing for nearly 70 years. I'm saying it now. The Aldridge farm sat in a shallow dip in the land, the kind of low ground that collects cold air in the mornings and holds it longer than anywhere else, so that even in late spring you could walk past his fence line and feel the temperature drop by several degrees, as though the earth there had its own private season. I noticed that every time I passed. It was not something I imagined. George felt it too, though he simply pulled his collar up and thought nothing more of it. I thought more of it. I always thought more of things than was perhaps useful. The house itself was a solid enough structure, 2 stories, timber framed, with a covered porch that faced east toward the road. Edmund had repaired it carefully when he first arrived, replacing boards, rechinkling the gaps, painting the window frames a dark gray that struck me as an unusual choice. Most people in Horrock painted their trim white or left it bare. The gray gave the house a withdrawn quality, as though it were trying to attract as little attention as possible. The kitchen garden was planted in neat, almost severe rows. The woodpile was stacked with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, each log placed with its cut end facing outward, perfectly aligned, not a single piece jutting wrong. I had seen tidy men before. This was something beyond tidiness. This was a man who needed the visible world around him to hold perfectly still. His cattle were healthy. His chickens were well kept. The fences were maintained. By every practical measure, Edmund Aldridge was an exemplary neighbor, and I understood even then that this was part of what unsettled me, the absence of any legitimate complaint. You cannot warn people away from a man simply because his woodpile is too precise or his window frames the wrong color. You would be laughed out of the conversation, and rightly so. What I could not explain, and still struggle to put into words even now, was the quality of silence around that property. Not the ordinary silence of a man who lives alone and has no one to talk to, something more deliberate than that. When I passed on the road and he was visible, working the garden, moving between the barn and the house, he would look up, register my presence, nod once, and return to his work. No wave, no called greeting, just that single nod, like a door closing politely but firmly. I began to feel that passing his property was a transaction he merely tolerated, and that his preference would have been for the road to route itself elsewhere. His one consistent point of sociability was the church. He came most Sundays, sat in the same pew, third from the back, left side, and listened to Reverend Colt's sermons with an attention that appeared genuine. He did not participate in the fellowship hour afterward with any warmth, but he stayed the appropriate length of time, spoke when spoken to, and left without lingering. Several of the women in the congregation made attempts to befriend him in the early years of his residence, bringing food after the harvest, that sort of thing. And he received these gestures with correct gratitude, thanked them appropriately, and never reciprocated in any way that might have encouraged a second visit. There was one exception to this general pattern of solitude, and it is important enough that I want to be careful how I describe it. In the late summer of 1861, this would have been perhaps 6 or 7 weeks before he disappeared, a man began to visit the Aldridge farm with some regularity. I saw him on 3 separate occasions, always arriving in the early evening, always on horseback, always alone. I didn't know him. He was not from Harwick, or if he was not someone I could place. He was younger than Edmund by perhaps 15 years, lean, with a hat pulled low enough that I never saw his face clearly from the distance I was at. He stayed each time for what seemed like 2 or 3 hours, and then he left. Edmund never mentioned these visits to anyone, as far as I ever learned. No one else in Harwick seemed to have noticed them, or if they had not thought to mention it. George, when I described the visitor to him, suggested it was probably a trading matter, a buyer for some of the cattle, perhaps, or someone with a business proposition. This was a reasonable explanation. I told myself it was a reasonable explanation. The war had just begun in earnest that year. Fort Sumter had fallen in April, and the country was pulling itself in 2 directions with a violence that even we, in our small corner of Western Virginia, could feel like a change in the pressure of the air, and men conducting quiet business away from public attention was not remarkable in such a climate. Still, something about those evening visits settled into me and stayed. I want you to understand the world we were living in at that moment, because it matters for everything that follows. 1861 in Western Virginia was not a place of clear sides and simple loyalties. We were a border state in spirit, even if not technically in law, and families were divided, neighbors were divided, and the question of where a man's sympathies truly lay was one that people had learned very quickly to stop asking directly. Trust, which had always been a currency earned slowly in that community, had become something almost no one could afford to spend freely. Edmund Aldridge had never stated a political view in my hearing, not once. In a community where almost everyone had stated something, if only through the way they spoke about prices, or the draft, or the news from the East. His silence on the subject was itself a kind of statement. I had filed that silence away, as I filed many things, without knowing yet what use I would eventually need to make of it. By September of that year, I was watching the Aldridge farm with an attention I had not admitted to myself was watching. The last ordinary day I remember before everything changed was a Thursday in early October of 1861. I know it was a Thursday because I had spent the morning doing the washing, which was always Thursday's work in our house, and my hands were still raw and reddened from the lye soap when I walked out to the fence line in the late afternoon to check whether the lower gate had been properly latched after George took the wagon out. It had not been, which was not unusual. George had many virtues. Attention to latches was not among them. The light that afternoon was the particular gold of an October that is decided to be generous before the cold comes in, long and amber and low across the fields. The kind of light that makes even ordinary things look like they're being preserved for something. The leaves on the oaks along the creek had gone deep rust and yellow, and the air had that faint sweetness of decaying leaves that I have always associated with the end of things, though not unhappily. Endings in nature always seem to me more dignified than endings between people. I was latching the gate when I heard Edmund's voice. Not raised, he was not a man who raised his voice, but clear enough to carry across the distance between our properties in the still afternoon air. He was standing at the corner of his barn, speaking to someone inside it. I could not see who. The barn door was pulled nearly shut, and the angle was wrong. I heard his voice, low and deliberate, and then a pause, and then a shorter reply from inside that I could not make out at all, lower than Edmund's voice, or perhaps muffled by the wood. I did not linger. It was not my habit to stand at fence lines listening to other people's conversations, and I had no reason at that moment to think what I was hearing was anything other than a hired hand or a passing traveler being offered a night in the barn, which was a common enough courtesy in those parts. I latched the gate and walked back toward the house, and I did not think about it again until much later that night. We ate supper as we always did, salt pork and cornbread and the last of the summer's green beans, put up in July and already beginning to taste more of the jar than the garden. George talked about the condition of the south field and whether it was worth attempting a winter crop or simply letting the ground rest until spring. I gave my opinion, which was that the ground needed rest more than we needed the marginal yield, and George agreed, as he often did when the decision was not urgent. We were comfortable with each other in the way of people who have learned that comfort is not a small thing. We did not mistake it for passion, but we did not undervalue it either. After supper, George fell asleep in his chair by the fire, which was also his habit, and I sat with my mending for perhaps an hour. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when a day has been used up properly, not empty, but settled. The fire had burned down to deep red coals by the time I banked it and took the lamp upstairs. I don't know what woke me. There was no sound I could identify at first. No crash, no voice, nothing dramatic. It was more like the sudden awareness of an absence, the way you wake sometimes and cannot name what has changed but know absolutely that something has. I lay still for a moment. George was breathing steadily beside me. The room was dark except for the thin blue light coming through the curtains from a half moon that had risen while we slept. And then I heard it, a lantern moving. Not the light itself, obviously. You do not hear light, but you hear what moves with it. Footsteps on dry ground, measured and deliberate. The faint creak of a gate that needed oil. These sounds are small, and in daylight, surrounded by other sounds, you would not register them. In the deep quiet of 2 or 3 in the morning, in a countryside where the only sounds are crickets and the occasional settling of your own house, they arrive with extraordinary clarity. I got up. I want to be honest about why. It was not bravery. I was not a brave woman in any dramatic sense. It was more that the alertness that had woken me would not allow me to lie back down, and my body had already decided to move before my mind had finished forming a question. I went to the window and drew the curtain back just enough to see. The Aldridge farm was visible from our upstairs window, not clearly, not in detail, but as a collection of shapes against the paler darkness of the sky. The barn, the house, the fence line, the oak at the far corner of his property that had been struck by lightning 2 summers prior and had survived with half its crown gone, so that it stood in silhouette like something interrupted mid-gesture. The lantern was moving from the direction of his barn toward the back of the property, where the tree line began. There were 2 figures. One held the lantern. The other was moving differently, not walking freely, but with the constrained, lurching movement of someone who is being guided rather than leading. The lantern swung once, throwing a brief arc of light across the ground. And then they were into the trees, and the darkness closed behind them like water, closing over a dropped stone, smooth and immediate and absolute. I stood at that window until my feet went cold against the bare floor. Neither figure came back out of those trees, not that night. Not in any night I watched afterward. I want to be precise about what I saw, because imprecision is the thing I have feared most in the telling of this. For 70 years I have rehearsed these details in the private theater of my memory, turning them over the way you turn a stone in your hand, checking every surface, making certain I have not added to them or subtracted from them in ways that memory so easily permits. I'm old enough to know that memory is not a reliable instrument, but I'm also old enough to know the difference between what I have imagined and what I have seen. And what I saw that night I have never confused with anything else. There were 2 figures. I've already said that, but I want to be more careful about it. The one with the lantern was taller, broad through the chest, wearing a dark coat that fell past the hip. He moved with the unhurried, proprietary ease of a man on his own land. I knew Edmund Aldridge's way of moving. I'd watched it for years across a fence line and a 1/4 mile of road. The figure with the lantern moved like Edmund. I cannot say with absolute certainty that it was Edmund, because the distance was real and the light was poor, and I am not in the business of claiming more than I actually possess. But if I am being honest, and the entire purpose of this is honesty, I believed then and I believe now that the taller figure was Edmund Aldridge. The second figure was shorter by perhaps half a head, slighter, and the movement, as I said, was wrong. Not injured exactly. There was no collapse, no dragging. It was more like the movement of someone whose decision about where to go had been removed from them. A guided movement. the kind of movement you see when a child is being steered by the hand through a crowd, or when someone very old and confused is being led from one room to another. Except this was neither a child nor an old person, as best I could tell from the silhouette. This was a grown man, moving with his own legs but without his own direction. The lantern swung once. That single arc of light lasted perhaps 2 seconds, no more, and in those 2 seconds I saw the following: the ground between the barn and the tree line, which was open pasture, yellow-gray in the lantern light. The back of the second figure, dark clothing, hands that appeared to be held together in front of him, though whether this was by restraint or simply the posture of someone walking with clasped hands, I genuinely cannot say with certainty, and I will not pretend I can. And the tree line itself, which began abruptly where the pasture ended, a dark wall of oak and cedar that ran along the back of Edmund's property and continued for perhaps half a mile into the hill beyond. Then the lantern passed into the trees, and the light was swallowed, and I was standing in darkness, looking at nothing but shapes. I waited. This is the part that I have turned over most often in my mind, the waiting. I stood at that window for what I believe was close to an hour, perhaps longer. The cold had moved up through the floor and into my feet and ankles, and I was shivering in a thin way. Not dramatically, just that persistent fine trembling that comes from cold and from a particular quality of alertness that will not let the body relax. George slept on. I did not wake him. Again, I want to be honest about why. I do not know exactly why. Part of it was the same instinct that keeps you still when you have seen something in the grass that might be a snake, a sense that moving, making noise, drawing attention to yourself, was the wrong thing to do. Part of it was something more shameful, something I have had to examine carefully over the years. I was not certain enough of what I had seen to act on it, or I told myself I was not certain enough. Whether that was true uncertainty or a more convenient form of it, I cannot fully untangle even now. No one came back out of those trees while I stood there. The lantern did not reappear. There was no sound that carried, or if there was, the night had thickened enough by then that it did not reach me. Eventually the cold became the dominant fact, and I went back to bed and lay there without sleeping until the sky outside the window began to go gray with the approach of morning. I said nothing to George at breakfast. I told myself I would wait and see. If Edmund appeared that day going about his ordinary work, then whatever I had seen had an ordinary explanation I had not yet understood, and I would have alarmed my husband over nothing. If Edmund did not appear, well, I would decide what to do then. Edmund did not appear that day. He did not appear the following day. By the third morning, when his cattle had begun to make the particular kind of sustained, anxious noise that cattle make when they have not been tended properly, the Whitfield boy from further up the road went to investigate and found the farm empty. The front door of the house was unlocked. The fire in the kitchen had gone cold. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, the plate still in its place, the fork beside it, as though Edmund had simply stood up mid-supper and walked out into the night, which in a manner of speaking I knew he had not done. I knew that he had not walked out alone, and I said nothing. The search began on the fourth day, which was a Saturday, and by Sunday after church there were 11 men with horses combing the woods behind Edmund's property and the creek bottom beyond it. George was among them. He came home that first evening with mud to his knees and a quietness about him that told me they had found nothing before he said a word. He sat at the table, and I put food in front of him, and he ate without tasting it, the way men eat when their minds are somewhere the body has not caught up to yet. They searched for 5 days in total. They found nothing that answered any question. A length of rope near the creek that might have been Edmund's or might have belonged to any of the dozen men who worked that land seasonally. A boot print in the soft mud of the bank that was too degraded by the time they found it to tell them anything useful. The trees themselves, which gave nothing back, just bark and root and the ordinary indifference of a forest that has no interest in human disappearances. Reverend Colt held a special prayer meeting on the second Wednesday after Edmund vanished. The entire community came, or near enough to it. I sat in the third pew from the front and listened to people speak about Edmund Aldridge with a warmth and specificity that surprised me, because most of it I had never witnessed in the years he had actually lived among us. He was described as hard-working, which was true, as honest in his dealings, which as far as I knew was also true, as a quiet man who kept to himself but bore no one any ill will. This last part was offered with the particular confidence of people who had never looked very closely. I sat through all of it. I sang the hymns. I bowed my head during the prayer. And the entire time, the image from the upstairs window moved behind my eyes like something trapped behind glass. The lantern, the two figures, the tree line receiving them and closing shut. What stopped me from speaking was not one thing, but several things braided together so tightly I could not separate them, even when I tried. The first was the uncertainty I have already described, the genuine, not entirely dishonest uncertainty about what exactly I had seen. The second was something more specific to the moment. The war was 3 months old by then, and trust had become extraordinarily expensive. To accuse a man, and make no mistake, saying what I had seen would have been understood as an accusation, required a certainty and a social courage that I was not sure I possessed, and was not sure would be received fairly, even if I did possess it. A woman saying she had seen something from an upstairs window in the middle of the night would have been heard through a particular filter. I knew that without being told. The third thing, and this is the one that has cost me the most across the most years, was that I thought I knew who the younger man was, the visitor, the one who had come 3 times in the weeks before Edmund vanished, arriving in the evening on horseback with his hat pulled low. And if I was right about who he was, then saying what I had seen meant saying his name as well. And saying his name meant something that I was not prepared in October of 1861 to say. His name was Caleb Puit. He was the second son of Warren Puit, who owned the mill at the edge of Harwick and was one of the most consequential men in that community in the way that millers tend to be, because everyone needs the mill, and the man who runs it knows it, and his goodwill is not something you throw away carelessly. Caleb was perhaps 25 that year. He had a wife, a daughter not yet 2 years old, and a reputation as a decent young man, if somewhat restless and difficult to read. He had stated no firm position on the war, which in retrospect I understood differently than I had at the time. I was not certain it was Caleb. I want to be clear about that. I had seen him 3 times from a distance, and I had seen the visitor at Edmund's farm 3 times from a distance, and something in the proportion of the figure, the particular way he sat a horse, had lodged a connection in me that I could not dislodge. But connection is not proof. Resemblance is not identity. And I was aware, even then, of how easily a mind under pressure finds the face it already knows in a shape it can barely see. So I told myself I was not certain enough. I held that not certainty in front of me like a shield, and I let the search conclude without result, and I let the community settle into the comfortable explanation that Edmund Aldridge had simply left. Debts, perhaps, or a woman somewhere, or some trouble from before his time in Harwick that had finally caught up with him. People are remarkably willing to accept the explanation that requires the least from them, and a man with no family and no deep roots is easy to explain as someone who simply moved on. I watched Caleb Puit at that prayer meeting. He sat 4 rows behind me and to the right, and I did not turn to look at him directly, but I felt his presence in the room with an acuity that had nothing to do with sight. He sang the hymns. He bowed his head. When Reverend Colt asked if anyone wanted to speak a word in Edmund's memory, Caleb did not rise. Neither did I. We both stayed seated in our separate silences while the candles burned and the prayers rose, and Edmund Aldridge's name was spoken by people who had barely known him into an air that held considerably more than any of them realized. I did not act on what I suspected for a reason that I have had to examine with great honesty over the years, because the easy version of that reason, that I lacked certainty, that I feared being wrong, was true but incomplete. The fuller version is harder to hold, and I will try to hold it anyway. 3 weeks after Edmund disappeared, I found something. I was not looking for it. I was walking the fence line on the eastern edge of our property, checking for damage after a heavy rain had softened the posts, when I noticed that a section of the split rail fence bordering the narrow strip of land between our property and Edmund's had been disturbed. Not broken, nothing so obvious. But 2 of the lower rails had been moved and replaced with a carelessness that was inconsistent with their original placement, and the ground on our side of the fence, in a patch perhaps 4 feet square, had been disturbed and then smoothed over in a way that the rain had partially undone. The earth there had been turned, recently enough that the rain had not fully flattened the edges of it, though it had tried. I stood there for a long time. The morning was cold and bright, the sky the particular hard blue of late October, and the light came across the field at a low angle that threw every irregularity of the ground into sharp relief. I looked at that patch of disturbed earth, and I understood with a certainty that arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation in my chest, that I was looking at the end of something, not the end of a mystery, the end of a man. I did not dig. I told myself that I did not know what it was. I told myself that disturbed earth after heavy rain was not unusual, that animals burrowed, that roots shifted, that there were a dozen explanations that had nothing to do with what my body was telling me. I told myself these things with the focused determination of someone trying to extinguish a fire by refusing to acknowledge the smoke. And then I walked back to the house, and I said nothing to George. This is the part that I am least able to defend, and I will not try to defend it. I can explain it, which is different. The explanation is this. By the time I found that disturbed ground, I had already missed my moment of relative safety. The search was over. The community had settled on its explanation. To come forward now with what I had seen and what I suspected and what I had just found would have required me to account for my silence of the previous 3 weeks, and that accounting would have been devastating, not only to me, but to George, whose standing in that community depended in part on the character of his wife. And Caleb Pruitt's family still ran the mill, and the war outside our small world was growing daily into something that made local order feel fragile and precious, and not worth disturbing over a man who had already been explained away. I'm not offering these as justifications. I'm offering them as the truth of what I weighed, in the way that I weighed it, in the autumn of 1861. People make calculations in moments of fear that they spend the rest of their lives paying interest on, and this was mine. What I did instead was watch Caleb Pruitt. Not obviously. I was not capable of obvious surveillance and would not have trusted myself to conduct it without being noticed. But Harwick was small, and watching in a small place requires very little effort. You simply pay attention to what is already visible, and you remember it, and you build from it. What I built was this. In the months following Edmund's disappearance, Caleb Pruitt did not behave like a man with nothing on his conscience, but he also did not behave like a man consumed by guilt. He behaved like a man who had made a decision he believed was necessary and had set it behind him with a thoroughness that I found in its own way more disturbing than anguish would have been. He was present at community events. He spoke normally. He helped his father at the mill. His daughter grew and his wife seemed content, and the ordinary machinery of his life continued to turn without visible strain. There was one moment, only one, in all the years I watched, that cracked the surface. It was perhaps 2 years after Edmund vanished at a harvest gathering at the Holt farm. Someone, I no longer remember who, made an offhand remark about the Aldridge property, which had been purchased by a family from over the mountain by then and was being worked again. The remark was nothing significant. Something about the condition of the fences, the work the new family had put in. I was standing perhaps 8 feet from Caleb when this was said. I was not looking at him directly, but I had positioned myself across the years to be aware of him without appearing to be, and so I caught it, the stillness, a fraction of a second, no longer, in which something moved behind his face and was immediately suppressed. His wife said something to him, and he turned to her and answered, and the moment was gone, sealed over as cleanly as that disturbed earth had been smoothed over in the rain. But I had seen it. I had catalogued it alongside everything else I had collected and could not use. There was a locked room inside me that held all of it, the lantern, the figures, the tree line, the turned earth, that single fractured second at the harvest gathering, and every year that passed added another layer of dust to the door of that room without making it any easier to open. What I did not anticipate in all my years of silent watching was that Caleb Pruitt would outlive his usefulness to my conscience by dying peacefully in his bed in 1923, at the age of 87, mourned by 4 children and 11 grandchildren, having never answered for a single thing. When Caleb Puit died, I was 85 years old. George had been gone for 11 years by then. The farm had been sold to pay the costs of his final illness, and I was living in 2 rooms at the back of my daughter Nora's house, with a window that looked out onto a vegetable garden that her husband kept with considerably less precision than Edmund Aldridge had kept his, which I noted with a complicated feeling every spring when the planting began. I had outlived most of the people who had shared that particular chapter of my life. I had outlived the chapter itself in the way that very old people outlive not just individuals, but entire arrangements of the world. When I read Caleb's obituary in the county paper, I sat with it for a long time at Nora's kitchen table. The obituary was generous, as obituaries tend to be. A man of the community, a dedicated father, a faithful churchgoer, a steady presence through difficult decades. His name in print, surrounded by those words, produced in me a sensation I can only describe as the final closing of a door I had spent 60 years hoping someone else might open first. As long as Caleb had been alive, there had existed the theoretical possibility that he might speak. That guilt, which I knew from my own experience to be a persistent and unreasonable tenant, might eventually drive him to say something. I had waited for that with a patience that had long since stopped resembling hope and had become simply a habit of waiting. And now the waiting was over, and nothing had been said, and I was 85, and the door had closed. I folded the paper and put it aside and did not speak about it to Nora. What the secret had done to my marriage is something I have thought about with great care, because George deserved better than what I gave him in that particular regard, even if he never knew it. He was not a man who needed to know everything about his wife. He was too respectful of privacy for that, which was one of the things I had always valued in him. But there is a difference between privacy and the kind of internal absence that a large undisclosed thing creates. I had a room inside me that was permanently occupied, and George lived his entire life beside a woman who was, in some portion of herself, always standing at that upstairs window, always watching the tree line, always waiting for the lantern to come back out. He never said he felt this. I never confirmed it existed, but I believe he sensed it the way perceptive people sense the things they're not told, not as information, but as a persistent atmospheric quality, like the cold that collected in Edmund's low ground every morning, present without explanation, felt without being named. There were nights when George would look at me across the supper table with a searching expression that lasted only a moment before he replaced it with something more neutral, and I would understand that he had been about to ask something and had decided against it. I was grateful for his restraint and ashamed of the gratitude simultaneously, because a woman should not be grateful to her husband for not asking the questions she is afraid to answer. The effect on my faith was slower and in some ways more damaging than anything else. I had grown up with a firm and untroubled belief in the kind of moral order that finds everything out eventually. The belief that truth has a weight that cannot remain permanently buried, that justice moves slowly but arrives. I held that belief through the first years after Edmund vanished, and through the decade after, and through the long middle years of my life, because releasing it would have required me to acknowledge that I had contributed to its failure. As long as I believed that the truth would emerge through some channel other than myself, I was not yet fully accountable for keeping it sealed. But the truth did not emerge. Caleb Puit died in his bed, and Edmund Aldridge remained whatever he had become after that October night, and the moral order I had trusted to compensate for my silence revealed itself to be considerably less reliable than I had required it to be. And when that belief went, it did not go loudly. It went the way the heat leaves a room when the fire is burned down, gradually, without drama, until one day you realize you're simply cold and have been for some time. What replaced it was not despair exactly. It was something more specific and more personal, a running internal account of what my silence had cost, itemized and precise. Edmund Aldridge, who had deserved at minimum to be found and acknowledged, whatever the manner of his ending. George, who had lived beside a partial version of his wife. My own sleep, which had been genuinely undisturbed only in the first few years before I understood the full dimensions of what I was carrying. The young woman I had been, who had stood at the window with cold feet and made a calculation that the woman I became had to live inside for the rest of her life. I did not tell Nora. I did not tell her husband. I did not tell the minister at the church I attended in my later years, though I came close once in a moment of particular exhaustion, and then could not find the beginning of the sentence. There is a particular cowardice in being unable to speak a true thing, not because you are afraid of consequences, but simply because you have held it so long in silence that the act of release has become physically incomprehensible, like trying to open a hand that has been clenched for decades. My hand stayed closed through George's illness and death, through Nora's children growing up and moving away, through the slow diminishment of my own body, the narrowing of the world to 2 rooms and a window, and a vegetable garden that bloomed and faded and bloomed again without any interest in my history, until it could not stay closed any longer. There is a morning that comes when you're very old, when you wake and understand with a clarity that has nothing sentimental about it, that the number of mornings remaining to you is small enough to count in a way that it never was before. Not a frightening morning necessarily, more like the morning when the last of the summer preserves is opened and you see the empty shelf and think, well, that is what there is. I had that morning perhaps 2 years ago, and what surprised me was not the fear I had expected, but a kind of brisk accountability, as though something in me had been waiting for exactly this recognition in order to finally proceed. I'd been carrying Edmund Aldridge for 70 years. I'd carried the lantern and the figures and the tree line and the turned earth, and Caleb Pruitt's face at the harvest gathering, and my own silence through 7 decades of ordinary and extraordinary life, and the carrying had shaped me in ways I was only fully able to see from the vantage of 91 years and an empty preserve shelf. It had made me careful to the point of emotional distance. It had made me a precise observer of other people and a poor confessor of myself. It had made me, in certain quiet ways that I do not think Nora ever fully understood, unavailable, present in body and in daily function, but with some essential interior portion always redirected toward that locked room and its accumulated contents. The decision to speak did not arrive as a dramatic resolution. It arrived the way most genuine decisions arrive, I have found, not as a lightning strike, but as the slow recognition that you have already made the decision and have simply been waiting to admit it to yourself. I had been composing this account in my mind for years. The words had been there, ordered and waiting, and what had been missing was not language, but the final relinquishment of the idea that I was protecting anyone by staying silent. Because that is what I had told myself, in the later decades especially, when the justifications of fear and uncertainty had worn too thin to use. I had told myself that speaking now would only cause pain to people who had not been involved. Caleb's children, his grandchildren, who were innocent of everything except the inheritance of a name. I had told myself that disturbing the settled ground of the past served no one. But the truth is that this was the most comfortable of all my self-deceptions, and I knew it, and I had used it anyway. The people I was protecting were real, and their innocence was real, and the pain that truth can cause to the uninvolved is also real. I don't dismiss any of that, but Edmund Aldridge was also real, and his disappearance into that tree line was real, and the small patch of turned earth along the fence line was real, and the fact that no one had ever said his name in connection with the truth of what happened to him. That was a wrong that sat on my particular ledger and no one else's. So I'm saying it now. I'm saying that I believe Edmund Aldridge did not leave Horrocks of his own will on that October night in 1861. I am saying that I believe the man I saw guiding him into those trees was acting with intent that was not innocent, and that the man I believe was involved in whatever followed was Caleb Puit, who is long dead and beyond any earthly accounting, as am I nearly. I am saying that the disturbed earth along the fence line of the eastern pasture of what was the Aldridge farm, in the location I have described, was never investigated by anyone because I never told anyone it existed. And I am saying that I was wrong to stay silent in 1861 and in every year that followed, regardless of the reasons I assembled to justify it, because reasons are not the same as rightness, and I have known that distinction my entire life and applied it unevenly. What I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all, is not the story of Edmund Aldridge specifically, though his story deserved to be told, and I'm sorry it took this long and this voice to tell it. What I want you to take is the understanding of what silence costs, not the silence of a moment, which is sometimes wisdom, but the silence of decades, which is a different thing entirely, a compounding silence, one that grows interest in the form of distance from the people you love, erosion of the beliefs that structured your life, and the slow replacement of your original self with someone shaped primarily by what she has chosen not to say. I have thought often in these last years about the young woman standing at the upstairs window with cold feet and a lamp turned down low in the room behind her. I have thought about what it would have taken for her to wake her husband, to say, "George, come here, look at this, tell me what you see." Perhaps nothing would have come of it. Perhaps George would have looked and seen two men walking across a field at night and found an explanation that satisfied him. Perhaps the truth would have emerged no more cleanly through that door than it emerged through any other. I do not know. I only know that she did not try, and I became her, and now I am 91, and the preserves shelf is empty, and the only thing left that is fully mine to give is the account I have just given you. Remember, Edmund Aldridge. Not because his story is exceptional. It is not, in its broad shape, exceptional for the times he lived in, but because he was a man who existed and then was made to disappear, and for 70 years the only person who knew the shape of that disappearance kept it locked in a room and called the locking prudence. It was not prudence. And if you are standing now at your own window, watching something you have not yet named, watching something your body understands before your mind has caught up, do not wait 70 years to say what you saw. The cold will come up through the floor regardless. Say it while the lamp is still lit.